Thank you for joining us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. The planet is reeling under extreme weather. Global temperatures are soaring to historic highs, and terrestrial rain have swarmed cities. Scientists say the target of keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels is moving beyond reach, with evidence of the crisis everywhere. And the World Health Organization chief urged world leaders to act, tweeting that the climate crisis is happening. To many, it may seem nothing, but today we'll have a look at how deadly this can be. Do stay with us. South Sudan is simultaneously drowning and drying as the climate crisis tightens its grip. A unique combination of catastrophic floods and devastating drought are driving hunger to unprecedented levels as access to food is pushed out of reach of families who were previously able to feed themselves. Two-thirds of the population, about 7.76 million people, are facing crisis or worse levels of hunger. This is the highest number ever, surpassing that seen even at the height of the country's civil war. 4 consecutive years of record flooding has led to widespread displacement, the destruction of livelihoods, and the loss of arable land. In March and April, rainfall was 50% above long-term averages over the Lake Victoria Basin, the source of the flooding, which means water levels are likely to rise later in 2023. At the same time, the onset of the rainy season has been extremely delayed, which will potentially affect crop later on in the year. In the southeast, 2 consecutive years of failed rainy seasons have contributed to an almost 20% increase in the number of critically food insecure people in Capiota since December. The effect of these concurrent climate shocks are compounded by rising food and fuel prices, an ongoing conflict putting basic meals out of reach of families who were previously able to feed themselves.
These are people with no income, no food for school children, no toilets, and no clean drinking water for children. The water here is unclean. The rainy season is here and we do not have plastic sheets. All their houses are underwater, so no one can stay there. We will be here on this dry island without shelter.
In a bleak milestone, more than 100,000 people have fled from Sudan to South Sudan since fighting broke out in mid-April.
The situation in this particular state is really bad. It has one of the highest malnutrition rates in all of South Sudan. So 1 in every 5 child is suffering from acute malnutrition here. And the numbers here are as high as 200,000 children who are in need of treatment. Unfortunately, we only have the resources as the World Food Programme to feed 62,000 of the 200,000 that are in need.
While this is going on in Sudan, high temperatures in July also brought record-breaking extremes across other parts of the world.
The global average temperature for July 2023 is confirmed to be the highest on record for any month. The month is estimated to have been around 1.5 degrees warmer than the average for 1850 to 1900, so the average for pre-industrial times. Heat waves were experienced throughout July in multiple regions around the world. Moving on from air temperatures to sea surface temperatures, the global average sea surface temperature continued to rise after a long period of unusually high temperatures since April 2023, reaching record high levels in July.
Local all-time temperature records were broken in at least 15 countries. Alongside the extreme heat, July brought record rain and fatal flooding. Behind these statistics were human tragedies, with deaths recorded across the world, as well as forest fires, water shortages, and a rise in heat-related hospital admissions. While directly impacting human health, the heat also caused large-scale crop damage and livestock losses.
2015 to 2022 were the 8 warmest years in the instrumental record, going back at least 170 years. And it's important to note this is despite persistent La Nina conditions that we had over the last 3 years. And the relevance of that is La Nina conditions tend to rein in the global average temperatures and suppress them slightly.
El Nino probably contributed to the additional heat in some regions, but rising greenhouse gases were the major factor, the scientists said.
This long-term warming trend, it's driven by continued increases in concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the 3 main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, they all reached record observed highs. The warmest year on record so far was 2016, and that particular year was associated with a combination of a very strong El Nino event at that time, on top of the long-term warming of the climate system.
The heat waves will become increasingly likely if emissions are not slashed. El Nino, which developed in May, also boasts global temperatures, and this climate patterns combination with climate change makes it highly likely that more months this year will set records. This year as a whole, we certainly rank among the hottest on record. Through June, it was the 3rd warmest year to date, behind 2016, which featured a monster El Nino.
So El Nino in the Pacific has just been declared a month ago, and this El Nino keeps warming the planet for the remainder of the year and probably until like early mid next year. But it has already started to help boosting the temperatures on the planet right now. And so this is part of the story, if you like, the second part of the story. So usually a temperature record occurs during El Nino years, and that's what we are just seeing. But the fundamental reason is our human-induced emissions of greenhouse gases.
Scientists estimate that prolonged periods of extreme heat are likely to hit every 2 to 5 years, rise to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Average temperatures are currently estimated to have risen more than 1.1 degrees Celsius. Without human-induced climate change, the event in July 2023 would have been extremely rare, according to a study by World Weather Attribution, a global team of scientists that examines the role played by climate change in extreme weather.
At the beginning of June, for the first time, we crossed the 1.5 degrees. Well, this happened before in our history, but in this summer, that was the first moment the 1.5 threshold was exceeded. At the end of June, we had a very significant heat waves in the Atlantic Ocean, in the northeastern part of the Atlantic Ocean. And this also contributed to the record-breaking temperature that we have seen at the beginning of July. The first week of July has seen 2 extreme temperature events, and at that time, the Copernicus Climate Change Services referred back to this as being the warmest temperature ever recorded. Now, 3 weeks into the month, slightly more than that, we can say that not only the first week of July was the warmest on record, but the 3 weeks of July were the warmest on record. And there is something else that we can do in terms of heat waves and the impact heat waves that have on our activities, and this is to reduce our vulnerability. So there are actions that we can take at the local level to make us less vulnerable to heat, to organize our city and our activities in a way that is more resilient and better suited to deal with extreme heat.
On his part, the head of the United Nations Climate Science Agency said the world would exceed the Paris deal warming target of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, saying states' policies had not been ambitious enough. In an interview a day after being voted, the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said the organization are committed to at least a little bit of overshoot of the long-term threshold set in the 2015 Paris deal.
If I think about all the countries in the world that have set net zero targets for greenhouse gas emissions, this is underpinned by the kind of reports that IPCC did. So I think IPCC is making a difference. And as a result of these net zero targets, governments are starting to put in place policies. They have not put in place policies that are ambitious enough to allow the goals of the Paris Agreement to be met. That is absolutely for sure. So in a sense, the train has left the station but we've got a long way to go on the journey in terms of climate action.
The 35-year-old United Nations body is responsible for assessing the latest climate change science through its authoritative report. Interest in this election has been high as extreme heat waves across China, Europe and North America have sparked fires and water shortages, bumping climate change up the political agenda.
And our colleagues in Working Group 1, the physical science part, have made it very clear that we are expected to reach 1.5 degrees around 2030, early part of the 2030s. In the best scenarios of all, we can start to bring these temperatures down again, But we are, I think, committed to at least some degree of overshoot, even if we're going to reach the Paris targets.
The new IPCC chief, a sustainable energy professor who has focused on mitigating climate change's impacts, said he had been personally surprised by the heat waves that the IPCC scientists have long warned would arrive.
Perhaps what is surprising is how quickly this kind of crisis has come to hit us. So I think the fact that such things are happening is, in a sense, not surprising. The speed with which it's come across us is, and unless we take further action to reduce emissions, we are going to see this actually getting worse. We'll see these events getting more frequent, and we will see them getting more intense. We will never, I think, be able to eliminate emissions entirely. There are some difficult sectors, and therefore the residual emissions will need to be compensated for by some carbon dioxide removal. And that's something that we absolutely opened up in the Working Group 3 mitigation report that came out a bit over a year ago. So there we are, carbon dioxide removal will, I think, have to be part of the picture if we're going to meet Paris goals. Some people have argued that we should take a more assertive role, perhaps get more into advocacy. Personally, I don't think that's a good idea, because IPCC's authority rests on the fact that we have got a convergence, a consensus between the governments of the world and between scientists. So it's never too late to do anything. I think we can get a little bit worried about iconic targets like 1.5 degrees. But the message from our last report, at any point, regardless of where we are, the benefits of action in terms of reducing emissions far exceed the costs of actually reducing the emissions themselves. The message is quite clear. It's still worthwhile doing things, unless you want it to get much worse than it is at the moment. So there is a case for action, regardless of where we are.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also warned that the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived.
Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning. The era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived. The air is unbreathable, the heat is unbearable, and the level of fossil fuel profits and climate inaction is unacceptable. Leaders must lead. No more hesitancy, no more excuses, no more waiting for the others to move first. There is simply no more time for that. It is still possible to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the very worst of climate change, but only with dramatic, immediate climate action. Many banks, investors and other financial actors continue to reward polluters and incentivize wrecking the planet. We need a course correction in the global financial system so that it supports accelerated climate action. That includes putting a price on carbon and pushing the multilateral development banks to overhaul their business models and approaches to risk. We need the multilateral development banks leveraging their funds to mobilize much more private finance at reasonable costs to developing countries and scaling up their funding to renewables, adaptation and loss and damage. We need ambitious new national emissions reduction targets from G20 members. And we need all countries to take action in line with my Climate Solidarity Pact and Acceleration Agenda. Hitting fast forward so that developed countries commit to reach net zero emissions as close as possible to 2040 and the emerging economies as close as possible to 2050, with support from developed countries to do so. And all actors must come together to accelerate a just and equitable transition from fossil fuels to renewables as we stop oil and gas expansion and funding and licensing for new coal, oil and gas.
El Nino, born out of unusually warm waters in the Eastern Pacific. It forms when the trade winds blowing east to west along the equatorial Pacific slow down or reverse as air pressure changes, although scientists are not entirely sure what kicks off this cycle. Because the trade winds affect the sun-warmed surface waters, a weakening causes these warm western Pacific waters to slush back into the colder central and eastern Pacific basins.
That this El Nino is happening while the world's oceans pretty much everywhere are warmer than average. That's not normally something that we see. El Ninos don't mean that the global oceans themselves everywhere pretty much are warmer than average. Usually El Nino, it's just you're thinking about the Pacific Ocean and ocean temperatures mainly around the tropics with some impacts north and south. But the fact that this is happening while the oceans are already so warm, the Atlantic is very, very warm. The Western Pacific is pretty warm. The Indian Ocean is really warm. So that in and of itself, even if there wasn't an El Nino, would mean that there's an increased risk for coral bleaching in tons of different places around the globe.
During the 2015 to 2016 El Nino, the strongest such event on record, anchovy stocks off the coast of Peru crashed amid this warm water incursion, and nearly a third of the corals on Australia's Great Barrier Reef died. In too warm waters, corals will expel living algae, causing them to calcify and turn white. This buildup of warm water in the Eastern Pacific also transfers heat high into the atmosphere through convection, generating thunderstorms.
So it's kind of almost a double whammy. You have warming oceans due to climate change, and then you have another thumb on the scale of warming related to El Nino, which can really be quite dangerous for corals across a large portion of the South Pacific and getting into parts of the Western Pacific even too on occasion.
This shift in storm activity affects the current of fast-flowing air that moves weather around the world, called the subtropical jet stream, pushing its path southward and strengthening it out into a flatter stream that delivers similar weather along the same latitudes.
El Nino is not like a storm. El Nino is not going to hit you on Tuesday. El Nino is all about changing the kind of patterns that weather plays in. So when we talk about a moderate or strong event, that's basically saying that El Nino has a stronger influence on creating the atmospheric patterns that might stay around a while for a period of time. So the stronger an El Nino, that usually means the more consistent impacts that we would normally see during an El Nino.
During an El Nino, the southern United States experiences cooler and wetter weather, while parts of the United States West and Canada are warmer and drier. Hurricane activity falters as the storms fail to form in the Atlantic due to changes in the wind, sparing the United States. But tropical cyclones in the Pacific get a boost, with storms often spinning toward vulnerable islands. Some parts of Central and South America experience heavy rainfall, although the Amazon rainforest tends to suffer from drier conditions. And Australia endures extreme heat, drought and bushfires. El Nino could offer a reprieve to the Horn of Africa, which recently suffered 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons. El Nino brings more rain to the Horn, unlike the triple-dip La Nina, which desiccated the region. Historically, both El Nino and La Nina have occurred about every 2 to 7 years on average, with El Nino lasting 9 to 12 months, La Nina which takes hold when waters are cooler in the Eastern Pacific, can last 1 to 3 years. How climate change might be affecting El Nino is a very big research question. While climate change is doubling down on the impact from El Nino, layering heat on top of heat, or excess rainfall on top of excess rainfall, it's less clear if climate change is influencing the phenomenon itself. Scientists are not sure whether climate change will shift the balance between El Ninos and La Nina, making one pattern more or less frequent. If ocean temperatures are rising across the board, it is likely the cycle will change, scientists say, as the basic mechanics behind the phenomenon stay the same.
Now, the interesting thing with El Nino and La Nina is that it doesn't necessarily create more extreme weather that happens in a given year. The difference between El Nino and La Nina is that we might have a better idea of where that extreme weather is going to happen. In any given year, let's say there's no El Nino or La Nina, sometimes it's kind of up to Mother Nature to figure out where those extreme weather events may happen. And that makes it difficult to plan in advance. The benefit with El Nino and La Nina, even though if you're in an area that sees a lot less rainfall or a lot more rainfall, is that one, we can predict El Nino months and months in advance, up to 6 months in advance at times. And then we might know where those impacts are going to happen, again, months in advance. This allows for a lot more planning to take place across the entire world.
However, if some parts of the ocean are warming faster than others, that could influence how El Nino plays out by amplifying temperature differences.
For 2024, I think is a year that if you're looking for a potential global record in terms of temperatures in El Nino with the continued warming since the 2016 El Nino, could lead to 2024 being one for the record books. But that is, of course, no means a guarantee because weather and the randomness of our atmosphere still plays a part. But most of the warmest years on record that we've seen in the past have happened due to the influence of El Nino because it gives that little bit extra push onto the global temperatures on top of the warming that we're already causing due to human-caused climate change.
Meanwhile, experts are currently concerned about what is going on in the ocean. And El Nino means that waters in Eastern Pacific are warmer than usual. Even before this El Nino began in May, the average global sea surface temperature was about 0.1 degrees Celsius higher than any other on record. That could supercharge extreme weather. Governments in vulnerable countries are taking note. Peru has set aside $1.06 billion to deal with El Nino's impacts and climate change, while the Philippines, at risk from cyclones, has formed a special government team to handle the prediction fallout. This year's El Nino could lead to global economic losses of $3 trillion, according to a study published in May in the journal Science. Shrinking GDP as extreme weather decimates agricultural production, manufacturing, and helps spread disease.
In general, El Nino tends to be a dry signal across the maritime continent, Indonesia, the Philippines, and getting into Australia as well across the June, July, August, September month period. So when you're drying out conditions, you're always going to be increasing the risks for wildfires. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a spark that sets off a wildfire, of course, or a bushfire, but a dry signal is not something that you would like to see if you're concerned about fires coming out for the rest.
And with the El Nino weather pattern, the World Meteorological Organization says for the first time ever, global temperatures are now more likely than not to breach 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that did not necessarily mean the world will cross the long-term warming threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. 2022's report had put the odds at about 50-50.
There's a 66% chance that we would exceed 1.5 degrees during the coming 5 years. And there's 33% probability that we would see the whole coming 5 years exceeding that threshold 1.5 degrees, which is of course not very likely to happen. it's practically sure that we will see the warmest year on record during the coming 5 years once this La Nina phase is over.
The likelihood of temporarily exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius has increased over time. Between 2017 and 2021, for example, scientists estimated just a 10% chance of hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unlike the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's climate projections, which are based on future greenhouse gas emissions, the World Meteorological Organization's update provides more of a prediction-based long-range weather forecast.
It's a conclusion that we haven't been able to limit the warming so far, and we are still moving in the wrong direction.
The WMO also found a 98% chance that one of the next 5 years will be the hottest on record, surpassing 2016, which saw global temperature impacted by about 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming. And with the warming world comes a warning of an increase in conflict. It is believed that while conflict exacerbates the effects of climate change, at least indirectly, drives conflict. Scientists have long warned that climate change caused by greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from burning fossil fuels, will make heat waves more frequent, severe, and deadly. They say governments need to take drastic action to reduce emissions to prevent climate catastrophe. Well, here is hoping government at all levels and each one of us here in Nigeria will do the right thing to curb the negative impact of the coming rains this year. That's our show for the week. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.